Hi and welcome to BiteSized BatReps Let's Play video. So this video is a little bit different. It's really aimed at you if you haven't played the game before, really. If you are already a player, then you probably know all of this. But if you have not really played the game, if you maybe have seen it at a convention or you've seen a demo and you're wondering whether this is something that you'd want to get into, then I wanted to share with you the top 5 gameplay mechanics that I think make the game really fun to play. So it's not a review as such, it's not really a complete look at the game. Rather, it's my personal take at the top 5 rules and mechanics that I really enjoy that keep me coming back again and again. Okay, let's get started with mechanic number 1, which is the orders and command mechanic. I think, to be honest, I think this is the core of the game. It's what makes it what it is. So the way it works is, in order for your units to do something, they have to have the correct order. So if you want your units to, for example, take up a new position or maneuver around the board, you give them a movement order. If you want them to hold a position and maximize their firing, then they get a defend order. And if you want them to get close and personal and into your opponent's grill, then you give them a charge order. And so before you start moving your units, you need to plan the whole phase, essentially, and distribute all of your orders, because all of this happens at the same time. Now, the orders come from your commanders, and the commander has a limited number of command points, for example, 3, which means that in any one turn, the commander can only give up to 3 orders. But there are other uses for the command points, and I think that's what makes this really fun, is that you always have to manage this precious resource of the command points, because instead of giving an order, your commander might be needed to, let's say, rally disorganized troops. So if you have a unit that's disorganized, you need to spend a command point to try to organize it. If your unit is fleeing, then again, you need to spend a command point in order to rally the fleeing troops. And so you can imagine that very quickly, just get these guys into a fleeing position here. So so in this case, your commander would be spending one of his command points and trying to rally the unit. So you can see that very quickly, as the game progresses, you will be running out of your command points, and then it becomes a very nice tactical decision to decide whether you want to give your unit a new order, let's say get them to move somewhere, or if you want to rally another unit, or if you want to do something else with the command points, which is, for example, boost a morale test or a skill test. And what makes this really fun is that nicely differentiates between the armies that are large but maybe have poor command, and so they'll always be behind on their commands and orders, and smaller armies that are more maneuverable, more disciplined, and they have always plenty of command, and they can always get their units to do what they want, but they just have fewer units to do it with. But there's even more to this, because when the orders are given out, they're all given out at the same time. So I'll give all of my orders, and then my opponent gives their orders. And they're given out face down. So that means if we have this situation, we've got 2 units kind of standing off, facing each other, 2 cavalry units, I can use my commander's point to choose an order and assign it. However, it's given face down, so my opponent doesn't actually know what I'm doing. Now, obviously, they might try to guess that it's a charge, and if you make appropriate comments like "let's do this" and kind of plop down an order, then they're probably going to think it's a charge. But the amazing thing is that you can't actually give the same order again. So even though these guys have a movement order, I can spend my command point and secretly give it another movement order. Make the kind of smack talking noise of "let's do this," and then my opponent will naturally think that I'm charging, so maybe they'll decide to countercharge. And then it comes down to the actual movement phase, and I'll reveal my order to be a move, then move my units out of position, and then my opponent will be forced to charge because they've committed to it and get themselves somewhere in the middle of the board where they don't want to be, and maybe expose themselves to a lot of fire or otherwise get themselves into trouble. And so this kind of orders poker mechanic is really fun because it really adds depth, where not only do you have to have the right order and you kind of have to plan your phase all at once, you can try to fake out your opponent and give different orders, and or try to guess what your opponent is doing, which just makes it that much more compelling. Let's keep going with the orders, because there's even more. So the other part of this mechanic that's fun is that your commander has only a certain command range, which is, for skirmish games, just 20 centimeters, so it's not very far at all. Which means that it's very easy to get units to be out of your command range, which makes them harder to give orders to, or impossible to rally, and otherwise difficult to manage. So when you're moving your units around, you really have to pay attention to where they are, where they will be after you move, and potentially where they'll be after fighting if they pursue further. And getting yourself in a position where your commander is out of range to your units is a very common mistake, and something you really have to pay attention to. So when you're moving units, you're constantly thinking, where do I want this guy to be so I can support my units, give them orders, maybe rally them, maybe boost their morale, but at the same time not get myself in a position where if I'm right next to you, behind my units, and my opponent charges and beats me back and I maybe flee, then they'll pursue right into my commander and maybe catch him and destroy him, which is obviously something that would be rather devastating. So this constant thinking of, all right, where is my commander? How much command does he have? Is he in command to my units? Can he support them? And where will he be at the end of the turn? So at the beginning of the next turn, I can actually use him to do something necessary, is part of what makes this mechanic a little bit more complicated than just giving orders. All right, let's go to mechanic number 2, which is the initiative order and the whole structure of the phase and the turns and how the game actually flows, which is maybe a little basic, but it's such a core concept to any game that I think it has to be really well done for a game to work. And so the way By Fire and Sword works is that it's not a you go, I go system where one side moves then the other. It's not a we go where we move one unit at a time. It's a bit of a hybrid because the phases supersede everything else. So first we give orders, and one side gives orders, the other side gives orders. Then in the movement phase, one side moves, then the other side moves, and then we both fight, we shoot, etc. Which means that even though first one side does all of the actions, the other side has a chance to essentially do their actions right after, and so you don't have this full cycle of move, shoot, fight before you get a chance to respond. Alright, so back to the way this works, and this ties into the orders mechanic. So the first thing you do is you give orders, right? So if you have, let's say, the situation, the Swedish player is within a short charge range on the flank of this unit, they might naturally want to say, okay, I'm going to give a charge order, of course face down, and here's one of those excellent mechanics and interactions that I really like about the game. So the Polish player sees this obviously as something that will most likely happen. His cavalry is exposed, and if he's going second, he's not going to be able to respond before these guys smash into his flank. So what he can do is give a charge order as well, and that charge order now becomes a counter charge. So this is one of those little mechanics that, even though it's a tabletop board game where we're moving pieces around the board, and first one side moves and then the other side responds. Traditionally, this is what would happen: is first side moves, goes into the flank, and this cavalry is caught in its side and probably gets wiped out or chased off. But here, what's happening is I'm declaring a charge, and it's my turn, or my initiative, so I get to move first. But because there's a counter charge, this cavalry is allowed to meet their enemy in the middle, as long as they can see them, which they can because they're in the front visibility arc. So these guys can essentially just approximated. Let's say move here, and then these guys in their initiative charge in, and now we meet head to head, which feels really more natural, because if you have this large body of cavalry and it's just standing there, it can see the enemy coming, so you get that sense that they would respond, they would spur their own horses and charge back. And so what I like about this is that it means that if you lose initiative and you're in some sort of a position, you still have a chance to do something about it. Now, it might not be a charge you wanted, it might be otherwise bad for you that you lost initiative, but you don't just get caught right into the side. Now, in order to get caught to the side where you can countercharge, the situation would have to be more like this, where the Polish cavalry can't see the Swedes at all, and in this case they can't countercharge, and then they will get smashed into their side or rear, depending on how the measurements work out. So if you totally mess up, you still get punished for it, which is deserved. You want to be able to take advantage of these mistakes. But in most cases, or in many cases, you can actually respond and have a fighting chance. So that's a nice twist to the traditional movement and initiative, where even if it's not your turn, you can basically counter move and counter charge. All right, here's another reason that the initiative is a really well done mechanic here. It really matters only in the first phase of the turn, which is the movement phase, because after we finish moving, everything else essentially happens simultaneously. So we shoot together, we fight together, and so any bases that get destroyed in fighting get to fight back. And so the fact that, let's say, you lost initiative isn't as punishing as it is as in some other games where you'll take losses and won't have a chance to fight back. So even in this case, if we connect, and let's say the Swedish side has the initiative and they attack and they maybe destroy a base or two, this unit will fight back in full strength, and so we'll have a chance to kind of inflict their own casualties, and then we'll resolve the combat as if they fought simultaneously. So that's really nice, because then winning initiative isn't devastating, or losing initiative isn't devastating. But where it really matters is the maneuver, and this is where, again, it's cool, because going first or second is better or worse depending on what you're trying to do. Now, going first really is a big advantage if you can connect with your enemy and force them to fight. So, in this example, we're within 20 centimeters, so if the Swedes have the initiative, they can catch this cavalry and destroy it, and maybe, let's make it a bit more interesting. So this is the situation. So the Polish cavalry is under strength compared to the Swedes, and so they don't want to engage them. So the Swedes win initiative, they'll charge, connect, and probably destroy. And so they really want to win initiative. Now, if the Polish side wins initiative, then they can, in their movement phase, put themselves out of range, and then the Swedes will not be able to charge and connect, and these guys survive. So here, quite clearly, going first is important, because these guys are within 20 and they'll be able to catch them. But if the situation is like this, where the Swedish side is just over 20, let's say 23 centimeters, and so they're past their initial movement, again, the way the phases work, and this is why it's fun, is in their initiative move, the first move, the Swedes will charge 20 centimeters, so they'll get up to here. And then the other side has a chance to move. So now the Polish side, and let's assume they have a movement order, assuming that, so they lost the initiative, Swedes are still charging, they can move now, and so they can move their full movement, so up to 20, so let's say they'll boot up here, kind of back up, and the Swedes now, in the finishing charge moves, will charge their remaining distance, which is 10, and not make it. There you go. And that's the end of the movement. So in this case, winning the initiative for the Swedes didn't really help them, because they couldn't get there in time, because the Polish side had a chance to move. And that's because the movement phase is split into two separate parts for charges. So that's the other side kind of react. So this is, again, this idea that you can't just boot across the board and catch the enemy before they have a chance to respond. But let's back it up a little bit. And so in this case, so again, we're more than 20 centimeters away. Now, if the Polish side wins initiative, so now they're moving first, well, they aren't sure that the Swedes are charging, because maybe they are, maybe they aren't. And if they put themselves in a position, let's say, not quite far enough, they reposition to here. Let's just make sure that that's... Then the Swedes will go, and they'll charge. They're 20. And then in the remaining moves, they'll charge another 10 and catch them. So the point of this is that going first or second, or going second, I guess, can be good if you can, because that lets you react to your opponent. So by giving up initiative, you lose this idea that you'll catch them first if they're within your kind of initial charge range. But by going second, you get this idea that now you can respond to their movement. So much of the time, you actually want to be going second, and sometimes you try to influence the initiative roll to go second, so that you can force your opponent to go first, and then you can respond to them, which I think is pretty cool. And the last point I wanted to make about initiative is that it is random, where both sides roll a die, and the higher number, the higher score gets to choose whether they want to go first or second. But you can influence with your command points. So again, you've got this precious command resource, and remember, these are the same command points you need to give orders and make your units do useful things. But if it's really critical, where you really, really need to catch, let's say, this unit on its flank, and if you don't, then you're giving up a big opportunity, then you can spend a couple of command points to boost your initiative roll, and not guarantee a win, but certainly make it much more likely, which is just another fun decision that you get to make at every turn, which is how committed are you to having a choice of whether to go first or second. And as a result of this random initiative, there's one more fun interaction that happens, and that's you're not guaranteed that you'll go after your opponent goes, and then you go. Because you can go first or second one turn and then first the next turn, you could go twice in a row, or move your units essentially twice in a row. So if, let's say, in this turn, the Swedes had the initiative and they moved up here, and then the Polish player has the initiative and they decide to move their 20, so they basically jump over to here with their elite cavalry. If the Polish player then wins initiative in the next turn, they're within 20. They'll get a chance to flank charge the Swedes, and the Swedes won't even be able to countercharge because these guys are behind. So if they had a charge order, so this is the next turn. Now, of course, to pull this off, a couple things have to happen. So first, the Swedes have to kind of overextend themselves and advance too far. And second, the Polish player has to win that second initiative, which means, in this situation, if both sides are rolling for initiative, that's exactly when the Swedish player might decide to, maybe it's time to boost this roll by even as much as 2 command points for +4 to the roll, because they really, really don't want the Polish side to win the initiative and charge to their flank. And of course, if they do this, then they'll have less command points, but such is the game. Mechanic number 3, and that's the art of movement or maneuver. And really what I mean by that is that maneuver really matters. So there's a couple of specific things in the rules, or specific mechanics that mean or imply that how you move is critical to whether you succeed or not succeed. So let's start with the simple things, which is a couple of key ranges in the game. The 2 ranges that are most important are 20 centimeters, because that's your initial move range, and as we covered, the charge range as well. So that means if you're within 20 centimeters of your enemy and you have initiative, you will get to them before they can get a chance to react. or move away. Now they might be able to countercharge you, but maybe they can't, they don't have enough command or whatever else. However, the key is that you will get there. So this is kind of like your impetus or initial fast charge move. So when you're maneuvering your units, and you can pre-measure always, which is nice, so you don't have that kind of weird guessing game. The decision of whether you want to put yourself, within 20 and kind of be in that aggressive, I'll definitely catch you stance, or outside of 20. Let's just make this a little bit more clear. Or outside of 20, which is that I'm threatening you, but we won't necessarily fight unless we both commit to it, is a critical decision, because obviously that determines the flow of the game and lets you kind of control the pace of it, whether you want to be pressing the aggression or not. So that's the 20 centimeter range. The other critical range is 10 centimeters, and that's because 10 centimeters is the effective fire range for pretty much most shooting, other than artillery or pistols. So the 17th century firearms were not terribly accurate, and they were only very effective at, or let's say somewhat effective at in close range, which in this game is the 10 centimeters. So let's say these musketeers are not very scary when they're far away, but within 10 centimeters they can certainly put quite a lot of damage into your unit. So let's just reposition these. As you're maneuvering, say this cavalry is coming up this way, you want to make sure that you're not inside of the 10 centimeters to most of these bases. Because if you are, then you take full effective fire, which is a lot more, typically a lot more hits, a lot more wounds. So this is kind of nice, because that means that as you're maneuvering, you really need to watch these angles. And sometimes what happens with when good players are playing is that they'll set up these traps where maybe you might have some musketeers standing here, some raiders, which are fairly powerful, and so these guys perhaps decided to charge, and so they'll charge and they'll come in here. But now they're exposed, they're flanked to a close range volley from the muskets, which is a terrible, terrible idea. So what might have been smarter for them is to try to maneuver somehow to have the same engagement, and this engagement is fine, but just here, so that they're just a little bit away from these musketeers at close range. The same thing can happen with other weapons. So the 10 centimeter and the 20 centimeter rule are critical, because they really determine how things go, and if you're not careful, you're not aware of them, then you'll keep on getting caught in situations where you're taking a lot more fire or getting charged where you didn't want to be. Then the other part of the maneuvering is the arcs, or the angles. So in order to have a flank charge, you have to be on the unit's flank, which is measured with the typical 45 degrees. So in this case, for example, these Polish Cossacks are to the raiders' front, but had they maneuvered over here, then now they're to their flank, and it's a much more dangerous charge. Now, what makes this fun is because, if you recall, the movement phase has a couple of places or phases of movement. So you might be good, let's say the raiders rotated themselves and they're feeling pretty good about this situation because they're now front to front. But with the double phase movement, where maybe these guys will move and then move again, so they were moved second and then they moved first next turn, or if for some reason there was a situation where they were able to charge into a couple of musketeers, and then obviously, let's say, break them, break them, or destroy them, pursue, and end up here, then now they're on their flank. So it's a different situation, and it's because the combat kind of moved and the figures repositioned. So when you're positioning your figs, or your units, you have to really pay attention to where they are, but also, which is of course, but also where they will be after all the different combats and movements are resolved. And the last thing I just wanted to mention about the art of maneuver is the speed of the cavalry. So the other part of this theater and this game system that's fun is that cavalry is pretty fast, and you can actually get a chance to maneuver them around the field really nicely. So your basic move is always 20. That's kind of the standard. So that's your the 20 range that we mentioned. But your charge move is your basic move 20 plus either 10 or 20 depending on whether you have essentially what I call fast horses or kind of regular horses. And for these Eastern type cavalries, then they typically always have the plus 20 horses, which means they charge 20 initial and 20 additional. So in this case, the way this would play out is in your movement phase, you get your unit, move it up 20. Now your opponent gets a chance to move, and because this is infantry with a defend order, they really can't do much more in terms of repositioning, so they'll typically just stand there and take it. Maybe they'll change their formation. And in the additional moves, your unit gets to move another 20. So now they'll basically close with the enemy, which is fun because that means really quickly you can cover a lot of the board, and chargers really feel like they're these thunderous affairs that have a lot of impetus, a lot of movement, and kind of connect with the enemy. So let's go to the next mechanic, which is dynamic and decisive combat. And I really like this about the system. So let's say this cavalry is charging into the pikes, the close, and sometimes in game systems what happens is we would be fighting this over a couple of turns, so we'd keep on rolling dice, and one side would get an advantage, and there'd be a multi-turn basically combat because they're engaged, and nothing else happens. But here, the nice thing is that this combat will get resolved this turn, always. So what happens is we fight a round of combat, and one side is winner or loser, and let's say the pikes lose, which is quite likely, then they're forced to withdraw half of their movement, which is 5 centimeters. And if they lose their morale, then they also get disorganized, but let's see, which is again likely, so let's go with that. So that's end of turn, or I guess the first phase of combat. Then we fight the second combat for the turn, and the cavalry gets the chance to pursue. We fight combat again, and now these guys are disorganized, fighting against cavalry, so now they'll almost certainly lose. And let's say they break and flee. They'll flee their 10 centimeters. And now this cavalry no longer pursues because we fought 2 turns of combat. But here's the beautiful thing, is that that combat's done. Now, next turn, these guys can rally, so maybe the commander is lucky enough and he rallies them, so now they reorganize and kind of place themselves somewhere here. And they don't have an order because they just rallied, but they're back in the fight at least, and now these guys are free, and so their commander can give them an order and do something else. Maybe they'll keep charging this, or maybe now it's time to go back to going for an objective, give them a move order, and they can move along and do something else. But the key point is that that combat got resolved, and the next turn we're moving again, so we're back to maneuver. So the game really is about maneuver, 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 then you get into combat, it gets resolved quickly in one turn, and you get back to maneuvering. And maybe you want to charge again in the same against the same unit, but the point is that you don't have to. You can actually charge a different target or go somewhere else. So you're never stuck in these protracted engagements. And as I mentioned, so that's if if one side wins. But what happens if neither side wins? Well, that's okay. That does happen occasionally where you have a tied combat. So let's just go through how that works. Alright, so you had these pikemen with a defend order, and the cavalry was charging, and let's see, we fought a round of combat. Both sides suffer some losses. Maybe there's a base lost on each side, and the combat ended up being a tie. Well, that's fine. All that happens is both sides withdraw half their movement. So cavalry goes back 10. And the infantry withdraws 5. And there you have it. And so after a tied combat, some casualties were inflicted, and we separate. And again, it's just like what I said before, this cavalry unit is now free to do something else this turn or charge again, but they can maneuver. You're back in control of your units. You're not stuck in combat. So I think that's keeps the game going and much more kind of flowing and dynamic. And the last part that I wanted to talk about is the meta game of the way the scenarios work and points for putting together your forces. So one of the kind of more unique parts of the game is that you don't agree to a point total that you're playing. You're agreeing to just the level, let's say skirmish game, and then both sides choose their forces. They can bring whatever points they want within their army list composition. And the way that's balanced is through two mechanics. One is scenarios, and the other one is additional effects. So with scenarios, that means if you have a weaker force, let's say you have a smaller infantry force, and you're facing a lot of elite cavalry, well, there's a good chance you'll have a defensive scenario, and let's say it's a defend the village scenario, where your infantry starts kind of dug inside the village, and this cavalry has to get you out, which is difficult. So the game becomes much more balanced and fair, even though you have maybe 6 points versus like 10 or 12 points on the other side. Now, of course, it's not perfect, and every game won't be 100% balanced or fair, but they'll all be interesting, and the bigger skirmish forces certainly don't necessarily have an advantage because they are always fighting tough scenarios, and they have a bit of an uphill battle. Now, the other part of the balancing, so in addition to scenarios such as like defend the village or defend a crossing, is additional effects. And so there's a gamut of these effects that can be applied to the stronger opponent. Anything from things like maybe one base gets lost in the beginning of the game, so kind of march losses, so you start a little bit weaker. You might end up with units being disorganized at the beginning of the game, so you set up your battle plan, and then the first turn your unit gets disorganized and has to withdraw, and so for 2 more turns basically they're futzing around the edge of the board while you're trying to rally them and get them back into the game. Maybe one of your units becomes insubordinate, which means it costs you 2 command points to give them an order, and as we covered, command points are really precious, so having one of your units be insubordinate always costing you 1 extra command point to give orders is kind of terrible. And so you might end up with this big force that sure has a lot more points, a lot of more units than this defending force, but you've got insubordinate units, you've got units that started the game without orders, and you have all kinds of other problems that you have to deal with. So that it just makes it really interesting because you're always playing a little bit of a different setup. So now let's talk about scoring and winning the scenario. So you've played your game, and did you win, did you lose? So there are 2 interesting aspects to this as well. So you get points for the scenario, and you get up to 6 victory points, and then you get points for your casualties. And so here's where it gets interesting. Let's look at the casualties. So this is about an 8-point Swedish Reiter force. You've got some armored veterans, a couple more veteran units, and regular Reiters. Now, let me show you how it gets divided for casualties. Okay, and just to illustrate my point about the way the casualties work and the points, I divided the skirmish force into the tiers that give you different points at the different casualty levels. So if you finish the game with no casualties, you get 6 points. If you get anywhere from 1 base to 3 bases killed, then you get 3 points. If you get anywhere from, 4 to 6, then you get 1 point, etc. And so the thing that is worth pointing out is that if you finish the game with no casualties, then of course you get 6 points, which is basically equivalent to winning the scenario, and clearly you dominate, but that's really unlikely. If you get 1 base killed, you get only 3 points, which means that losing that 1 base will essentially kind of cost you 3 victory points. But after that, you can get 2 more bases killed and not lose any more points, because you'll get your 3 points regardless of whether it's 1 base or 3 bases. And the same is true for the next level. So once you get to 4 bases killed, you lose 2 more points because you only get 1 victory point, and then you can lose another 2 bases, again without a difference. So the initial casualty counts are kind of important. They're really expensive because they cost you 3 points first, and then 2 more points until you're down to 1 point. But once you get into this range where you're getting 0 points for having all of these guys killed, if you look at it, if you lose 7 bases, you break into this range, and now you can lose up to 4 more guys without any other victory points lost. So that means, let's say you're playing against the Swedes, and you've already killed 7 bases. Well, you'd need to kill another 4, 5 bases to get any more victory points out of them, which is fairly difficult to do. And so that means pretty quickly, once you get into these ranges of casualty sets, you're better off just focusing on the scenario and maybe limiting your own casualties, but you don't have to kill chase. It really won't help you. The only time kill chasing will help you is if you're just on the verge of taking your enemy from one set to the next set of casualty rates. And if you're having a terrible game and maybe you lost a lot of bases, like basically half of your force, well, now you can lose another whole bunch of guys before you go to the final level of a massacre, which is nice because that basically means if you're doing well and you're not taking any casualties, then it's very valuable to protect your troops. But once you get into this area of you're getting kind of slaughtered, then you have a lot more leeway, and you can basically try to then double down and get the scenario or cause more wounds to your enemy without worrying that every single base you lose will cost you more. So it just helps to equalize the game a little bit and help you not feel like you're losing outright, even if you did take some losses, as long as you take care of the scenario. And just to finish off the scenario point and winning the game, so the final part of this that's really cool is that once you score your victory points and you have, let's say, 4 victory points for one side and 6 victory points for the other side, that gets translated to a victory level, which is basically draw, tactical, strategic, or historic victories. And those victories have ranges. So if you would beat your opponent by 1 victory point, then that's a tie. If you beat your opponent by anywhere from 2 victory points all the way to 5 victory points, or to 6 victory points, that's a tactical victory, which is quite the range, right? Because it's anywhere from 2 victory points, which is maybe one scenario objective, all the way to 4 or to 6. That's still the same level of victory. And so in a tournament game or just in friendly games, that there's quite a bit of a leeway. So to go from tactical to strategic, you have to go for 7 victory points at least, which is very difficult to get because that means you have to dominate the scenario and do something better on casualties, or do really well in the scenario and really well in casualties. All right, obviously there's so much more to cover with this game, and I just skimmed over some of the rules, but I hope you enjoyed this video and kind of why certain rule interactions I think are really compelling, and they work very well for a competitive, fun game that can work well in both tournament settings and friendly play settings and kind of story-driven settings, because there's just so much more to kind of learn and master. And this really is one of those games where you can start playing reasonably quickly, but it will take you a long time to get all of the different interactions down and learn how to kind of maximize the terrain, maximize your opponent movements, and win. Alright, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about any of the rules, or you're not clear about anything, please comment below and I'll do my best to answer. And as always, see you next time on BiteSized BatReps.